say that I really appreciated Big E's speaking. There's so many insights to take away from your presentation, and so I really appreciate it. So I hope that people get a chance to maybe like review it on the YouTube channel, and I'll put it up on the SoundCloud as well. I'm not going to go too long. If anything, I really just want to speak out against this war that Trump and his gang are trying to drag us into, another war for oil that Bolton and Pompeo in particular are trying to kind of convince the workers that it's their war, you know, and because this poses such a terrible risk to so many of our working class sisters and brothers, we have a duty to speak out. Because the capitalist-owned media is duty-bound to cheer on these same wars, just like they did in the lead-up to the war for oil in Iraq and in Libya, and just as they recently have done with regards to Venezuela. So I want to stress the seriousness of the situation, and I want to emphasize how costly such a war would be, and I want to try to make some sort of account of the risks involved. It's a very serious matter. I also want to dispel some of the lies about Iran that are used to sort of stupefy folks into consenting to a war in which we have absolutely no interest. The lies aren't new. Iran is a rogue state. Iranians are terrorists. Iranians hate our freedoms, to quote the war criminal W. Bush. These lies and slanders aren't meant to dupe. They're meant to dupe us into believing that our interests coincide with the interests of the shareholders at ExxonMobil. But it's not our freedoms that U.S. soldiers will die to protect. It's ExxonMobil's. They, along with the executives at the Royal Dutch Shell and BP and so on, they count on the U.S. military to guarantee their freedom to plunder the Earth's resources, regardless of the country in which that Earth happens to be. They, like all capitalists, want the freedom to exploit without having to consult the people that they intend to exploit. And with the Trump administration and his policy of American energy dominance, which has seen the U.S. become the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas, climate be damned, this particular sector of the capitalist ruling class that is involved in energy production is emboldened. I was reading earlier today that energy subsidies in the United States are comparable to the budget of the official budget of the Pentagon, that is around $700 billion a year. And despite signs that overproduction is leading to inevitable crisis, there are signs, for example, that demand is slowing in China. Low oil prices and the increased share of energy production controlled by U.S. sheltered monopolies has prompted a bid by the State Department to expand by means of outright plunder. So this comes as a terrible risk to humanity and to the people of Iran and Venezuela in particular. And so I want to conclude the statement that I'm making by saying that I want to make the case, as Big East alluded to earlier, that we have a real stake in defending any country's right to determine its own course independent of U.S. domination. I want to stress that this right to self-determination is not an abstract legal right. In fact, the stand that we take on this issue means life or death for the working class right here and right now. There's no denying that far above any other factor. Imperialist wars, that is, wars for profit, pose the biggest obstacles to the liberation of the working and oppressed people of the world. Consider this. The U.S. is 18 years into a seemingly endless war in Afghanistan. And in the past 20 years, more than $6 trillion, that's, of course, U.S. taxpayer dollars, have been wasted on U.S. wars, which have resulted directly in the deaths of 480,000 people. Several times as many have died from the after effects of these wars. Communities around the world, and particularly in the Middle East, have been wrecked for generations to come because of these wars. And so our actions must take this terrible catastrophe into account. So first things first, some background on Iran. Iran is a country of 80 million people. And in terms of land mass, Iran is 4 times the size of Iraq. It's a country that's rich in resources. Most notably, it sits on the 4th largest oil reserves in the world. And along the southern coast runs the Strait of Hormuz that you've maybe heard about in the news. Around a fifth of the world's oil and a third of the world's natural gas passes through this port. So it's of extreme importance to the global capitalist systems. Iran is a country with a developed capitalist economy, which reflects 2 seemingly contradictory historical facts. One, it has extensive diplomatic and trade relations throughout the region and the world. In other words, it's not an isolated country by any means. The country couldn't carry out industrial production on the scale that it does without the input of foreign resources and access to international markets. And because of these deep ties to allies and to trading partners in the region, it's unlikely that a U.S. attack on Iran, which, as we know, recently, the Pentagon had written up and nearly executed, an attack would not go unanswered by other nations. It's really not alarmist to claim that there's a real risk that a war with Iran could grow to the proportions of a world war. At the same time, because for the past 40 years, the United States and its imperialist partners have sought to undermine Iran's national development, whether through outright war, for example, the disastrous Iran-Iraq War of the 80s, or through sabotage, or through blockade. The government of the Islamic Republic, with a fair amount of planning, it has to be said, has committed to a path of development based on self-sufficiency. In other words, they focus on boosting domestic production and scaling back dependence on imports. The challenge of the Iranians now, of course, is to withstand the sanctions which were reimposed on it last year when the U.S. Unilaterally withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This is the so-called Iran nuclear deal to which all permanent members of the UN Security Council and the EU are signatories. So it's not just a treaty between the United States and Iran. And to be clear, Iran did not once violate the terms of this agreement, which required that they submit to near constant monitoring of their domestic nuclear energy program in exchange for the lifting of sanctions, which of course were having a very serious effect on their ability to trade, etc. So far, Iran has weathered these sanctions, and in no small part because the government and the Iranian people have no more illusions about the lengths that the United States will go to terrorize its victims into submitting to its control. The Iranian people have not submitted because they don't want to be ruled by terror.
Yes.
As they were under the U.S.-backed Shah. This is the prince that presided over a CIA staff police state from 1953 to 1979, when the Iranians finally ousted him in a popular revolution. The Iranians have refused to give up their national security, despite the fact that the stated goal of the State Department is to reduce Iranian oil exports to zero, despite the fact that Pompeo boasts that the sanctions on Iran are the strongest in history, despite the fact that Pompeo makes threats that the leadership, quote unquote, has to decide whether they want their people to eat or not. And you know, seriously for a moment, let's remember that the toll of this warfare that is euphemistically called economic sanctions, which has been a favorite weapon of the United States since it assumed itself the last remaining superpower on the planet. It's because of U.S. blockade, aka sanctions, that an estimated 40,000 Venezuelans have died, otherwise preventable deaths, since 2017, according to a report that was made a few months ago. If you can stomach it, I would say go and watch the infamous video of former ambassador to the United Nations and former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, during which she owns up to the mass murder of 500,000 children because of inhumane sanctions imposed on Iraq. Again, the Iranians are resisting these brutal attacks because time and time again, American imperialists have shown that the U.S. Wants nothing more than to reduce Iran to the status of a colony. The Iranians, of course, will never forget the hard lessons of the early 50s when U.S. And British espionage agencies orchestrated a coup that replaced the democratically elected bourgeois national government of the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh with the tyranny of a monarch, the Shah. His name was Reza Pahlavi, part of the Pahlavi dynasty. The CIA and its counterpart, MI6, did all this to orchestrate the coup on behalf of American and British-based oil monopolies, basically, who couldn't stand that in 1951 the Iranian parliament dared to take control of its national oil industry, which had until then been under the control of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This is later known as British Petroleum. You might recognize it as BP, the same company responsible for the horrible Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. By the way, BP now stands for Beyond Petroleum, so I guess it's all water under the bridge. In 1953, once the nationalization of the oil had been reversed, that is, once the coup had taken effect, the Shah, for the price of some royalties, handed over control of his country's oil fields to a consortium of companies that were then known as the Seven Sisters. This is British Petroleum, BP, Gulf Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, and I'm just going to say Total. You know the name of it fully, right? Yes, it's a French company, and of course Texaco and ExxonMobil. Until the 1970s, these companies controlled 85% of the world's oil reserves. Their share of global oil production has diminished. That is relative to state-owned oil companies, but their influence has hardly waned. Just ask Pompeo's predecessor, former U.S. Secretary of State and ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson, who had no small part in working on the project to bring down the government, the Bolivarian government of Maduro. Under the Shah's rule until 1979, thousands of social leaders, trade unionists, workers, students, and peasants were tortured and murdered by SAVAK, the SAVAK. It's a basically Gestapo-like agency set up by the CIA. And inequality soared to become almost the worst in the world, according to the International Labor Office. All this time, Iran served as a U.S. garrison in the Middle East, similar to the way that Israel functions today. So they were doing all the dirty work. They were one of the top arms consumers in the Middle East at the time. Now Saudi Arabia and Israel have filled their place. But as the saying goes, oppression breeds resistance. In 1979, the Iranian masses rose up to overthrow the imperialist-backed Shah. And although many of the demands of this progressive revolution have been betrayed by the government of the Islamic Republic, they replaced the monarchy. National independence remains a victory that the masses of Iranians are very much intent on defending, in fact, defending to the death. And so, to counter some of these kind of slanders about Iran, you'll often hear in the big business media, the capitalist-owned media, about sort of tyrannical mullahs and all of this. But consider who the U.S. State Department sees fit to replace the government of the Islamic Republic. They openly promote the most reactionary elements of Iranian society, including Reza Pahlavi, the son and heir to the throne of the disgraced Shah. That's pretty incredible, but apparently he lives just outside of Langley, the headquarters of CIA, conveniently. Else they speak of restoring democracy as they promote the National Council of Resistance. This is an organization aligned with the fascist Saudi Arabia and Israel. And this is why Iran has held strong in the face of these really crippling sanctions. And so, because they've not been, they do not submit to U.S. control. The U.S. war hawks, along with their allies in Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, have stepped up their tactics. Of course, hoping to escalate to outright war. We know recently on June the 12th that the Secretary of State Pompeo blamed Iran for an alleged attack on 2 oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman. This was the same day that it occurred, that he decisively put the blame on Iran. Of course, this claim contradicts the accounts of the tanker crews who were brought to safety by Iranian rescue crews. And both tankers had cargo bound for Japan, and the attack occurred on the same day that the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was in Tehran on a very important historic diplomatic figure. But as we all know, and all too well, U.S. lies have power, especially when they're played on loop by the monopoly media. In 1898, the first large-scale imperialist war in U.S. history started with a hoax. Remember the Spain. Remember the Maine. The hell with Spain. Yeah, exactly. I mean, at the time, that was a slogan that was reprinted again and again by the monopoly press of its time, the Hearst Yellow Press or whatever. With the help of John Bolton, of course, the United States condemned Iraq to years of war on the now disproven claim that the Iraqi government possessed weapons of mass destruction. And this, to me, this recent incident in the Gulf of Oman recalls the now debunked Gulf of Tonkin attack, which gave President Johnson the pretext to authorize the war on Vietnam in 1964. I mean, this is something that even the Secretary of Defense at the time, McNamara, admitted was a complete fabrication. And as a result, more than 3 million Vietnamese men, women, and children died, and more than 56,000 U.S. troops lost their lives. The record of U.S. wars for oil speaks for itself. The U.S. war on Libya has resulted in the revival of slave markets and the ascendance to power of a U.S.-backed warlord, and former CIA asset, General Haftar. U.S. sanctions and war on Iraq resulted in the deaths of more than 1 million people and in the birth of Daesh in the region, ISIS. And so I want to just end by saying that that we do have a stake in the defense of any country to resist U.S. domination. Anywhere that the U.S. prevails in a war for profit, the international working class loses. And as long as the capitalists are unrestrained in their power to colonize a sovereign country for cheap resources and the labor, we're screwed. The wages and living conditions of the entire working class will continue to worsen as long as their race to the bottom is unchecked. This means that we must defend the sovereignty of nations and that they resist the domination of the giant capitalist monopolies that the U.S. military serves and protects. The Islamic Republic of Iran is, we should say, no worker state, but the workers there have a much better chance at organizing political power for themselves, free of U.S. intervention.
Right.
We workers are also better off anytime that we can check the power of the oil tycoons and the war profiteers who will lead us into the abyss so long as they can accumulate more for themselves. And so we must demonstrate our solidarity with our fellow working class sisters and brothers across the world. We must demonstrate our solidarity with the people of Iran, and we must all say hands off, U.S. hands off Iran, call for an end to the criminal U.S. sanctions against Iran, call to bring all U.S. troops home, to close all U.S. NATO bases, and to end U.S. aid to Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Yes.
All right now, Comrade Joseph, thank you. So you've given us the full breakdown here in terms of Iran. We've had an opportunity to hear from Big E what's transpiring in terms of Sudan. We're hearing from both of them. We're following the pattern and trend now between what's being shared. And if we weren't talking about Sudan, or if we weren't talking about Iran, we could list out several other places around the globe where this same story is playing out. Different name, different place on the globe. So what we really need to be asking ourselves as people who live here in the United States, as residents here in the United States, what does that mean for us in terms of our understanding of that?